Good afternoon, everybody, for attending our first virtual roundtable. This is a first for the Pearl Initiative. This roundtable was scheduled to be held in person before the current circumstances have arisen. We're trying to pioneer testing in terms of how we can virtually hold these. So this is our first of its kind. We hope that we can extend the interactivity that we usually have in our live person events. Obviously, it might be a little bit difficult, but we do want to promote interactivity, and obviously there's a virtual platform. So if there are any questions, please field those through to us and we'll try and answer those and keep it as interactive as possible. Sorry, we can't offer you tea or coffee or biscuits like we usually do, but hopefully we can share some expertise and insights of our esteemed panelists today. Obviously, we're talking about governance in the healthcare sector, both aspects, corporate and clinical governance, and hope that we find it useful and valuable. Before I proceed, I'd like to thank our speakers. Sophie and Orhan, thank you so much for giving up your time and dedicating some of your time to this. I know we've all got quite busy schedules in terms of crisis planning and reactions to what's going on, but thank you very much for kind of keeping this going, and we can have the plan delivered by virtual webinars. So I'd like to introduce Sophie first. Sophie is one of our neighbours in our headquarters in Sharjah Research Technology and Innovation Park. Sophie's co-founder and CEO of NAPTA Health, a hybrid healthcare company for women headquartered in SRTIP. Prior to co-founding NAPTA, Sophie worked for Accenture as a technology consultant and then founded several impact enterprises, including My Zindagi, a doctor finding platform in Pakistan, and Le Plastics, a plastic recycling company based in Sierra Leone. Sophie's honourable lifetime ambition is to make healthcare affordable and accessible for all women. To this end, Sophie is a patron of King's College London MedTech Society and a mentor with Sherry Blair Foundation and Ma'an Social Incubator in Abu Dhabi. Sophie read history at the University of Cambridge and completed an MBA with Quantic School of Business and Tech. Welcome, Sophie. Orhan is Osman Soy, is operating partner at TVM Healthcare, headquartered in Dubai. He has over 25 years experience in the field of private equity, merchant banking and equity capital markets. Prior to working at TVM, he was MD at Frontier Management Group, where he worked with a broader team at Apollo Management to source and evaluate private equity and private credit transactions across a wide range of transaction types, including leveraged buyouts, mezzanine financing, and structured purchase. Prior to these roles, Orhan has wide experience in US and London-based investment firms, as well as Morgan Stanley. He is a graduate of the University of Virginia and holds a master's from Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you both. So before we start, I'd like to kind of just give a quick introduction, and then I'll hand over the questions to our esteemed panelists. As you know, regionally, we have a rapidly evolving healthcare sector across the Gulf, driven by a demand for high-quality healthcare, coupled with the region's ambition to become a healthcare hub for medical tourism. Today, we wanted to get your perspectives as to what distinguishes healthcare organisations that excel at consistent and continuous outcome improvement from those who do not. What is the biggest contributing factor to success when it comes to outcomes improvement in healthcare organisations? And of course, the role of governance in the healthcare industry. We do have two interlinked forms in the healthcare sector in particular, these being the general corporate governance, but also the clinical governance, which is defined as governance in the workplace and addressing the quality and security of the provision of healthcare by medical professionals themselves. So I guess I'd like to start off by throwing it out to you. How would you define the distinction between clinical governance and corporate governance generally in the healthcare industry? Sophie?
How would I define the difference between clinical governance and corporate governance? I guess they are fundamentally different things. One is about, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Clinical governance is much more focused on the adherence to quality standards and the measurement thereof within a practice. Making sure that the services that are offered to patients adhere to guidelines defined by organisations such as NICE in the UK, and that you are continuously evaluating the quality of the service you provide. Corporate governance is around making sure that your operations, your finances, your adherence to kind of best practice in terms of accounting, auditing, etc., are transparent, are organised, and are visible. I think there have been a couple of players recently in the healthcare ecosystem here who have very obviously failed to adhere to best practice from a corporate governance perspective. One big healthcare provider, and then another in healthcare investment portfolio management. I think it's not a problem that is unique to the healthcare ecosystem at all. And I don't think it's a problem that is unique to this part of the world either. The WeWork debacle shows that it's very possible for companies that have had a lot of investment put into them and are perceived extremely well in the public sector to have a lot of holes from a governance perspective. So yeah, I mean that's the fundamental difference between the two things, I think. Orhan?
Yes, no, I concur. Obviously, corporate governance, which is more overarching, is the process, by which you'll see companies being directed, being controlled, being managed. Clinical governance, I think, relates more to managers, clinicians, staff, and even government bodies, and how they among themselves share responsibility and accountability. So I think the two concepts have parallels, one with the other. Sometimes that line can be blurred. And obviously, I think this makes the case for probably something which is more integrated. Let's call it integrated governance, that I think arches, clinical with corporate governance.
Perfect. I mean, so you lead me on to my next point. So I think one of the problems of governance in the healthcare industry does emerge when one of the elements, corporate or clinical governance, is weak or underperforming. Is there a link in terms of which one exacerbates the problem per se? Is there one that should be prioritized when operating? And what should the relationship be? When you say integrated, to what extent should we have it integrated?
I would say the bigger problem here is not necessarily around the relationship, which should be symbiotic between clinical and corporate governance. It's actually to do with the parameters that underpin both of these things. So from a clinical governance perspective, it is known and accepted that this is a kickback culture, that kickbacks are given on every test, almost without exception, that is prescribed, on every drug that is given, on every procedure that is performed. As long as you have a culture in the healthcare ecosystem where kickbacks are given, you will never have a system of clinical governance that is as transparent or adherent to best practice as it ought to be, because everybody operating within the ecosystem, ahead of having the health and well-being of their patients at the forefront of their minds, has a commercial driver. So, and this is something that does not exist in other parts of the world. In the UK, for example, it is illegal to take or to give kickbacks for anything that is prescribed in the medical sector. So I think, and it relates to the bigger question around trust in the ecosystem, to the question about whether the UAE is ever going to establish itself as a hub of medical tourism. If clinicians and healthcare providers here cannot be trusted to provide care that is in the best interest of the people that they purport to serve, no one is going to come here to be cared for. In fact, at the moment, we see the exact opposite is happening. People are paying tens of thousands of US dollars to go outside the country for specialist care. And I think a lot of that has to do with the extent to which the ecosystem is trusted. Is this something that can change? Yes, of course. I think one of the things that is missing, again, from the ecosystem is a real hub or drive to research and develop, to discover new ways to diagnose and treat patients. There's a serious lack of clinical R&D that occurs in the country. What you have, if you have these hubs of R&D, is you have excellent clinicians and scientists who flock in order to discover new things and to attach their names to these new discoveries. There's then there are patents and other intellectual property registered. There are documents, articles, etc. published, and these clinicians, these really excellent, world-beating clinicians, stay because they see that they are being recognised not only for the care that they're providing, but for the mark that they're making on the medical sector. And these clinicians don't need additional commercial drivers. They are happy to they are happy that their legacy is something bigger than the money that they put in their pocket at the end of the day. So then you start to be able to kind of develop a value-based ecosystem based on foundations that are rooted in excellence. Then the system starts to be a little bit more trusted, and then the medical tourists come. So I think the question around the symbiotic relationship between clinical and corporate governance is an interesting one, but actually there's a much bigger question, which is how do we move from a commercial to a value-based care model here that allows people in the country to trust us implicitly and always.
Brilliant, thank you. I'd like to just go back to the culture. You mentioned that we have a culture that doesn't exist essentially anywhere else in the world, that doesn't permit the kickback culture. Obviously, it's mandated by legal laws and regulations elsewhere, but do you think we need to wait to that extent here, or do you think hospitals and healthcare organizations can take that initiative to stamp out that culture within their own organizations and then that spreads wider? How would you propose overcoming this culture from your perspective?
I think there are a couple of players in the market that I know do not give or take kickbacks, or at least on the surface they say that they don't. If healthcare providers individually were able to and willing to do this, it would solve the problem very quickly. The reality is the 3,500 hospitals and clinics in the UAE are at 30% occupancy. So people are fighting for a piece of a market that is small and decreasing in size every day with the addition of new hospitals and new clinics. And I would say that there is a misperception that giving and taking kickbacks will increase your revenue share and your share of the market. Actually, that's not necessarily the case. Providing really excellent healthcare, being seen as a trusted provider and one that is recommended from in everywhere from women's forums online to discussion groups and panel discussions such as these. That's a much better way to drive increases in footfall. I think, again, if the government was to mandate to ban kickbacks in any way, shape or form overnight, there would be an immediate change. There would be a lot of healthcare providers would go out of business, which is a scary thing for anybody to hear, but it would quickly sort the problem of oversupply in the market and force those players that remain to up their game in terms of the standard of the care that they provided. I think increasingly, as the population, not just here but globally, becomes better informed, better connected, and aware of the, I guess, remote monitoring and kind of technology-enabled solutions available to them, there will be increasingly a grassroots level drive for better healthcare, better and more trusted healthcare. So I think it'll be a pincer movement really, from the top at a government level, and then from a grassroots level as well. And the healthcare providers with foresight will get there first, will start to change their operating models first. But many of them are so attached to the kickback culture that until the government mandates it or until they go out of business, there will be no change.
Thank you.
I would add to it my observations as an investor. If you see in some of the more developed economies of the West, we've seen many go through some level of integration within their healthcare systems. And to Sophie's point, to eliminate perhaps excess capacity in the healthcare industry, to improve access to care, to reduce costs. And all this, I think, results ultimately in an increasingly complicated governance structure. And such movement also obviously results in a wave of M&A and divestitures, etc., something which we haven't seen so far in this region, or at least by choice, not by default. So that's one. And I think within the region, it's also important to make a distinction between the various types of healthcare institutions, whether it's for-profit and not for-profit. And I think a bunch of these here typically are for-profit. So in countries where these healthcare platforms or systems are for-profit, and where the legal system, let's say, is a bit underdeveloped or compromised with respect to malpractice, then you're going to see pressures for sound governance, where such governance frameworks might be less focused on or accentuated. And so I think you've got to look at it both ways. How fragmented is this market? How populated is it or crowded? And then what we tend to see also is that many of these are owned by financial sponsors, by investment companies, to our earlier point, PE shops or family offices. And I think this profit versus for-profit inclination, especially in a backdrop where the rule of law, or perhaps the legal system isn't quite as proof or as sound as we have in other markets in Europe or further afield in the West. I think all this adds a strain to perhaps these clinical or other governance aspects that we've touched on. And case in point, just today, one of the serious substantial players in the field has been subjected to such compromise. And so when boards are made up of insiders primarily and the like, this ultimately translates into conflicts of interest and doesn't set the right example for accountability, which is at the core of governance as we speak of it.
Thank you both for your perspectives there. So, I mean, you touched upon kind of the current situation that has arisen and the case in the news at the moment. But I mean, for you as an investor, when you evaluating an investment, what is it that you're looking for? Do you look into the corporate governance structures in these organizations? How much of that is a driver into your decisions? Also, in parallel, I'd like to kind of touch on Sophie's point. So Sophie mentioned that if we want to make this region a healthcare hub, we need to attract the right talent. We need the renowned clinicians, doctors to come, and we need to incentivize it for them in the sense that they can become pioneers. And essentially, it means that we're going to have to start investing a bit more in research and development. I mean, when you've got investors that sometimes have short-sighted interests, how are we going to counterbalance that to ensure that we have the investment into research and development in the region? And who is the onus on to incentivize that?
Orhan, I think the question's with you around investing into healthcare companies.
Look, obviously, TVM is a healthcare, monolithic investor. We're not a sector-agnostic PE shop. We only invest in healthcare. We continue to be very upbeat and I think very bullish on the healthcare trends in the region, in the Gulf and the broader MENA. Generally speaking, if you look at the historical healthcare spend here, through a variety of metrics versus the West, you see substantial underinvestment. At the end of the day, the population that we look to capture is one which is growing and aging, and then ultimately there are other drivers on the back of, call it urbanization and lifestyle and so forth, that are also causing other elements that drive growth, such as NCDs, non-communicable diseases and the like. So on the back of all of that, I think we're able to come in early and craft an opportunity around the white space where we feel that no one else has come in and deployed capital effectively. A case in point, for example, is one of our portfolio companies in long-term care and rehab called Cambridge, CMRC. That business was set up, over 7, 8, 9 years ago, at a time when a lot of a lot of what happened around rehab and post-acute care was very much hospital centric. Our view was, and we call this internally, the continuum of care theme, to weed people out of these ICU beds into long-term care and rehab centers, and then ultimately, as and when these patients feel a little bit better, you ultimately take them home and take care of them within the confines of their homes. And so we've been very deliberate about the thesis around these long-term care, these rehab centers, and also around home care and home nursing. And we continue to do that. So with regards to elements beyond the investment thesis, when we talk about governance, you've got to bear in mind that as a PE investor, we either set up these businesses from green or brownfield status, or if they're already ongoing businesses, we buy into them, as a majority shareholder. So from our perspective, we're able, being the single owner, if you will, or the majority owner, to align our view around the growth trajectory of that business with management. And so I think that is very key. What's the dynamic between the owner, the board, and the management team? That's the I think, pinning pillar of corporate governance. And so being a majority shareholder and a private equity owner, where this business sits in our, under our auspice in private form, I think we're able to craft early on an ethos around what we feel works and doesn't work for us around these corporate governance elements. So alignment here is very key. And alignment is very key because we obviously, as owners of these businesses, also need to monetize our ownership 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years out. Private equity firms, as you know, do that. That's their business model. You buy into a business, you own it for a certain timeline, and then ultimately you need to exit. And so we're big believers also that marrying a good investment thesis, but also with best governance practice, is a unique recipe, if you will, for value enhancement and value creation, not only for us as owners, but also for our own investors, our own LPs, so our other stakeholders, but also for the benefit of the business, its management team, its staff, and so forth. And this alignment is further understood.
Oh, the first technical glitch.
Have you seen the webinar bingo memes that have been going around?
No, not yet. Let's hope this one doesn't turn into one. Let me see.
They're very funny, actually. Let
me see. I think he did mention that he had a questionable Wi-Fi connection that could go out anytime. So let me see. Right. In the meantime, Sophie, while Orhan is out of, now we can talk openly about what approach we think investors should take. And not here to defend his position. So, I mean, obviously he's been very clear about the fact that investors, it's an investment for them. They want their financial returns. It's 8-10 years. They need it to realize the financial returns. But obviously we have the intrinsic problem of investment into R&D to make it sustainable, especially for the region. How do we balance that with the financial goals of these investors? Because it's who's currently investing in the sector. And how do we promote the research and development aspect in the region?
I think you very much adopt a one investor doesn't fit all approach. One size investor doesn't fit all. So we're also talking now about a couple of different categories of company potentially. You've got traditional healthcare providers, clinics, hospitals that are investment opportunities. You've got health technology businesses, which come in various shapes and sizes that now do investment rounds from pre-seed all the way through to Series D, E, F, and eventually to IPO. The category of investor that you look for at all of the different stages is different. The extent to which they do due diligence at every stage is different at the pre-seed and seed stages. So this is when you kind of basically have it. Pre-seed is the idea stage. seed is a kind of MVP to market stage, and then any Series A plus all tend to be growth stages of investment. It depends how much money you're raising, what the investor's looking for. At pre-seed and seed stage, investors tend to invest predominantly in the entrepreneur, the founder, and the founding team, and the wider team. It's more about, you have this idea, and these are the people who are going to deliver it. Do I think these people can execute on this idea? And that's what investors typically get behind. At the Series A, where you will have institutions investing sizable amounts, you have a lead investor who will typically do all of the due diligence, which will include diligence into corporate governance, structures, the unit economics, etc. And then all of the investors that follow will invest on the back of the due diligence the lead investor did, on the term sheets that were signed, etc. So it depends on the kind of company you're talking about what, when you ask the question, what should investors do or not do? From an R&D perspective, R&D again has several phases. So typically you have the discovery phase, which is where you try and work out to what extent the idea that you have is valid, patentable, is it going to work, etc. Then you have the pre-commercialization phase, where you will take the idea that you have and you will get it to a pre-production point. And these phases in other parts of the world are usually covered by grant funding, which is either exclusively public or a kind of combination of public-private money that don't have any strings attached to it. And in the UK, there are also tax rebates on R&D. So you can claim back up to 30% of the money that you spend on research and development every year, or 33%. The investors would typically come in at the commercialization phase. So when you have something that is ready to go, they would invest. And so in many respects, investing into companies that have a big R&D mandate, if you're getting in, I guess, beyond an early stage, so after pre-seed and seed, it tends to be the same decision-making that companies you would make into a company that doesn't have any R&D. Do they have a product that is ready to be commercialized? Can I help to grow and scale this product? The problem that we have here is that grant funding isn't readily available. We are in the process of establishing what will be the region's first serious grant fund for R&D in the Sharjah Research Technology Innovation Park. To date, grant funding comes, in kind of 10, 50,000 dirham chunks, but that's not enough to build a point of care test from the ground up, or any other kind of medical device, diagnostic tool, digital therapeutic, etc. So this is the problem that we have here, is that then what we ask investors to do is to invest at the discovery phase in R&D, which is where normal private investors would not normally get in and get behind equity investments. So the water's a little bit muddied, and you end up having companies that have an R&D mandate going outside the country because they can't find the grant funding and non-equity investments kind of readily available here. Again, something I think that is changing. We're definitely doing our level best to change it, but the type of investment that you're asking for is different if you are a company that has R&D. And again, when the company grows, any company worth its salt should be putting a substantial amount of its net profits every year back into research and development. Over 80% of the FTSE 100 companies do so. So again, once you've achieved a certain scale, some of the funding for R&D will come from internal sources. But yeah, the lack of grant funding in the region makes it difficult for R&D companies to thrive here the way that they should.
Perfect. And I know you mentioned, by the way, welcome back, Orhan. We carried on, diverted quickly. So you mentioned that currently at RTIP, you're in the process of setting up a fund. In terms of attracting more grant funding in the region from international sources, not necessarily from regional sources or on the ground, what do we need to do to develop our infrastructure and our systems and policies to attract further grant funding? I
think sadly, the truth is that there are very few early adopters anything in any market, the vast majority of the population tend to follow rather than to lead. So if we want to attract grant funding from international sources, we need to prove that we have our own grant funding and are successfully supporting companies in research and development here. We need a few more active research institutes that are producing things that are both that can be qualified and quantified. So we need to see more patents outside of universities being registered. We need to see more patents being commercialized. We need to see more articles being published in world-renowned journals. Probably we need more of our own, really renowned local journals. We need to show that as a region, we are capable of producing groundbreaking research, and then attracting grant funding from overseas won't be a problem.
Understood. And at the moment, it's predominantly happening in universities on the ground only.
So all that I've heard for the last 2 to 3 months in the context of the current coronavirus is, what can we do to contribute to the pandemic? Not contribute to the pandemic, to stay the pandemic. What can we do? Why aren't we developing vaccines? Why aren't we researching or trialing combinations of antiretroviral drugs? Why are we not capable of doing anything in the UAE, that is? And the truth is that the R&D ecosystem just doesn't exist. It brings up a kind of broader question around the extent to which the R&D that has happened in the context of COVID has been efficient and productive. There obviously have been a lot of different bodies working in isolation, which is never particularly effective. One of the things that we're doing in SRTIP is establishing a decentralized peer-to-peer network for clinical research and best practice. So we're building our own actually hybrid healthcare research center and our own clinical center of excellence, which will, I guess, through from a technology-enabled perspective, through a consortium blockchain, connect and also power and drive discovery with multiple other players as nodes on the network. But this is the sort of system I think that we need to see, not just in the UAE, but globally, to accelerate discoveries during pandemics such as this. So, yeah, I've now gone off slightly on a tangent and forgotten the original question. You have to bear with me, it happens.
No, how do we? It was very useful. It was how do we attract more grant funding, international grants for the region?
Showing that we're capable of doing R&D, I think, is the short answer.
Yeah, I mean,
I think this also underscores the need to really, overlay, public spending in the space with private spending or private involvement in the space, whether it be financial institutions, financial sponsors, family offices, or any of the above. I think the role for private sector generated funding here is primordial. Now obviously the objectives that one have if you come in with a for-profit mindset is a bit less altruistic, frankly, right? As I was discussing earlier before I got cut off, the returns, the valuation need to make sense. The investment thesis needs to hold. But then also, I guess, more practically within healthcare, you would deploy capital presumably in businesses that have a first mover advantage or an early mover advantage. Businesses where you're convinced there's an expanding medical need, one where reimbursement schemes are perhaps more visible or more acceptable. And then you look at things like working capital, capex requirement, and so forth. So the approach is more measured. On the one side, obviously, you want to do well and do good because you're a healthcare player, and your aim is to grow and expand a certain platform within the subsector for the benefit of the greater community. But also, which links us back to governance first and foremost, our stakeholders include investors that expect us to generate certain returns as a PE shop. And so these elements around valuation, the investment thesis, the exit pathway, are key. And so we need to marry one with the other. But ultimately, I think every dollar which is deployed is only accretive. And to Sophie's earlier point, hopefully can help bridge the gap or at least plug the holes.
Brilliant. Thank you for your frank perspective and your honest input there. Is Sophie still connected? Sophie? No, Sophie's gone, I think. Yep. Okay. So, I mean, so Sophie obviously mentioned that, FTSE 100, 80% of the listed companies invest back into R&D. Is that something that you evaluate into when your investment, and I know it's obviously a totally different investment, but is that something investors are starting to ask for and look into? Obviously, we come into a more kind of corporate stewardship approach to investment. We need to look at the well-being of broader society and not just our own personal financial returns. Is that something that you see investors looking into, what they're doing to contribute back to society? Is that a requirement?
Yes, I mean, we all know and are convinced that healthcare is going through an incredible transformation, right? Whether it be in R&D or whether it be in technology, diagnostics, people speak of telemedicine, evidence-based medicine, AI, and the like. And that I think that transformation creates opportunity, and obviously, if you will, makes some of the allocations more captive. And then there are also new technologies, perhaps in healthcare, which will have meaningful impact on all stakeholders. So if you're a patient, healthcare becomes more accessible, it's faster, it's more transparent, it's more targeted, perhaps more self-managed, and all of us here, will have to take more ownership, I think, of our own health. And so with all of this, and when you look at what is happening right now in a world which is increasingly flat, a world which is growing very fast, especially in the emerging markets of MENA or Asia or further afield in the East, I think there's an opportunity for us in the emerging market in a certain way to leapfrog legacy healthcare solutions, which historically were the paradigm in the West. And so for folks like us and others, I think all this creates an opportunity, which combines, the need for, I guess, good and strong returns, but also a thirst, if you will, to strive for, being impactful and doing good. I don't see the two as being mutually exclusive.
Thank you. I'd like to go back quite a bit just to the kind of clinical governance and the corporate governance aspect. I think looking at the way quality is reported and governed, and the quality of data that's being reported and analysed and shared. In terms of quality driving the strategy of healthcare organisations on the ground, I think I'd like to address this to you, Sophie. How do you see quality driving the strategies of, I mean, I know you say we've got a broad healthcare sector here, but broadly speaking, across the sector as a whole, in terms of strategy, the capability and culture of the organisation in terms of delivering on that quality, the processes and structure in place that are then in place to measure the quality that's being delivered in driving the whole strategy of our healthcare sector in the region.
So I'll talk, I think, about specifically what we're doing in NABDA. So we're a hybrid healthcare company for women, woman-shaped healthcare. So actually, in terms of improving the overall quality, measuring quality and adherence to it in organisations that we work with, we're doing one key thing, which is defining our own best practice guidelines for women's health. So we're focusing on some of the big areas in women's health, so on fertility, on reproductive health, on some women-only or women I would say non-communicable disease in the context of women. So looking at the diagnosis and treatment of cardiovascular disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, looking at cancers, particularly focusing actually on gynecological cancers, and defining new quality standards and measures for these. We're using some of the kind of globally recognized quality standards, such as the NICE guidelines, as a starting point. but really fleshing them out in terms of all of the latest evidence-based research that has been done. For example, we know now that there is a very close correlation between hormonal imbalances such as polycystic ovary syndrome, oligomenorrhea, etc., with underlying metabolic disorders. It's thought globally that it was between 60 and 70%, but actually we know it, and particularly in this region, to be closer to 100%. So 100% almost of women who have polycystic ovary syndrome have diabetes or a precursor to it, pre-diabetes, insulin resistance, etc. So a lot of the best practices regarding how do you diagnose, treat, help women to manage conditions like polycystic ovary syndrome are very outdated, because they don't take into account these newly discovered correlations. So we are going through and systematically creating new substantiated quality standards and ways of measuring performance against them. There are some areas in women's health here that are particularly far behind, I would say, the kind of globally recommended standards or levels. One of the most obvious probably is the C-section rate. So the planned C-sections are more common here than vaginal deliveries. So vaginal births after cesarean are almost non-existent. And there are significant implications for this, not just for the mother, but also for the baby. It's that new research suggests that vaginal deliveries are very important for the population of the microbiome in the gut of the baby. Increasingly, there are shown to be connections between C-sections and the likelihood of babies developing autism. So reducing the planned C-section rate across the UAE healthcare ecosystem is a primary target for us. Reducing the episiotomy rate. Episiotomies here, again, tend to be done pretty much as standard because it makes delivery easier, because the secondary complications aren't really taken into account. Episiotomies have a whole lot of knock-on effects that make recovery for a mother much harder, mean that she is more likely to suffer with postpartum complications from a mental health perspective, make it harder for her to eventually bond with her baby. So there are some kind of key targets that we have, I guess particularly again focusing around fertility, prenatal and postpartum care. But I think as with everything, in every industry, you should be constantly rethinking what is understood to be best practice and working out whether it still is and whether it's still relevant and whether anything could be done to improve it. And this is the attitude that we're taking towards women's health. It should be an attitude that the UAE healthcare ecosystem as a whole adopts as standard.
Perfect. And then, I mean, you mentioned the example of the C-sections. I mean, is this a healthcare system topic or a driven kind of issue, or is this kind of education on the ground within the community? How would you balance, but how would you evaluate that on your part?
It's a little bit of both. Again, there's a commercial. There basically, from a clinician and a healthcare provider perspective, at the moment there are too many incentives attached to C-sections. Doctors can charge more and do charge more for C-sections. C-sections are planned. So if you have 90 patients, which would be a huge number, but if you had 90 patients who you were seeing and expecting to deliver, if you could slot them into your diary 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you know when they come in and you know it's going to be a 2-hour appointment and then you're done, you would choose to do it without considering the implications necessary for women from a recovery and also a long-term healthcare perspective. One of the things that we will have attached to our Clinical Centre of Excellence is a birthing centre to support women who want natural deliveries. Giving birth is a pivotal moment in a woman's life. It is something that can be an immensely empowering or disempowering experience. It's a moment where you can feel like, I think, where a lot of women truly understand the might of their own might and their own abilities. bringing a new life into the world. And so it's important that this moment in time is treated with the respect and also with the care that it deserves for everyone, regardless of a background or circumstances. So I think there are yes, as I said, there are too many commercial and convenience incentives attached to delivering C-sections, and not enough, I guess, regulations to prevent them from being done as standard. Doctors, I guess, various corrective measures that could be taken is allowing doctors to charge more, encouraging doctors to charge more for vaginal delivery, or charging less for C-section delivery. We don't want people to start charging even more than they do already. Giving doctors, incentivizing doctors to provide proper prenatal and postpartum support, not just in terms of appointments, but also in terms of antenatal courses, in terms of lactation consulting, in terms of follow-ups, home care, postpartum, which I know is something that Mansell with TVM Healthcare does a lot of. So yes, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. And then in terms of regulation that you say, we need to kind of de-incentivize the commercial aspect of the delivery of services, healthcare services. Again, are you anticipating that this should be a regulatory change that comes into place, or is this a culture within the healthcare sector? I mean, long term, again, I'd say there was probably a business case for it, in instilling confidence into your patients and reputation, and you are known as a provider that does what you need to do and serves the best interests of the patient. But do you think the healthcare sector will do that themselves? Or do you think we're going to have to wait for intervention, external intervention?
I think if COVID-19 has taught us anything, it's that we can advise on best practice. We can put a whole load of measures in place on an individual and at a grassroots level to enforce best practice. But until the government steps in and mandates that something must be so, it won't be done, or not adhered to 100%. And then after a while, actually, as people adjust to the new reality, they start to self-regulate. But initially, all regulation has to be enforced from the top down with a sufficient amount of grassroots support. If you try and enforce regulation without grassroots support, you get a revolution. And that is definitely not something that we want. But everybody, I mean, we have analysed hundreds of thousands of conversations in online women's forums. The lack of trust in the healthcare ecosystem here is endemic. Most of the women who come onto forums asking questions are asking questions because they trust the opinions of their non-medical professional friends more than they trust the opinions of their doctor. And you'll see lots of posts where women will take a photograph of what's been prescribed by a doctor and say, hey, how much of this do I need to give to my child? And then they will receive 50 opinions from, again, and this is not best practice and not something that I recommend at all. But the fact that it's happening suggests that if there was to be government mandates that encouraged a value-based care system, remove the commercial angle and commercial bias, or help to mitigate it somewhat, there would be massive grassroots.
Perfect. All right, I'm just going to throw it to the audience at the moment because we've got a couple of questions. So Bernard is asking, how does the legal framework in the UAE for clinicians play into achieving optimal governance ideology, e.g. episiotomy and aversion to secondary complications versus criminal and civil legal implications on physicians?
That was a long and complex question that we heard about 50% of. Would you mind repeating it?
How does the legal framework in UAE for clinicians play into achieving optimal governance, e.g. episiotomy and aversion of secondary complications, versus the criminal and civil legal implications on physicians deemed to be malpracticing?
I think it's a bit of a grey area. In theory, if you can prove that medical negligence results in harm, then you've got a legal case on your hands. Medical negligence here is hugely underreported. Some of it is a lack of awareness on the part of consumers. some of it is a belief very strongly that if were it to be reported, nothing would be done. I think, again, because there's a little bit of because kickbacks are prevalent and are accepted, there is an understanding that the corruption that this effectively entails within the system means that other corruptions, other breaches of best practice would also be kind of quietly overlooked by the authorities who have the power to legislate against them. So I think if you had there is no, I mean, individual providers have feedback systems in place, pretty ineffective ones, but they have them in place. There isn't a particularly easy way or transparent way for consumers to report cases of medical negligence, or ways for those cases to be followed up. I know that there are a couple of companies working on whistleblowing technologies, but most of these tend to be internal rather than external, and aren't to highlight things like medical negligence in clinical care provision. So I think it's a grey area.
I think what's very key here also is the culture that embodies the platform, the healthcare platform. I know in our case we're also obsessive, if you will, around the culture which overlays a portfolio company. You know, a culture which I think homes in on quality, but also on safety. You know, one which is very patient-centered, ultimately. And then responsibility and accountability are very, very important, whether it's the board or the CEO and the C-suite. It is very imperative, if you will, to delineate that very clearly. You know, and how do you use these measurements being shared with you at the board? Because even if you're using these best matrix, sometimes these numbers don't reflect, if you will, a totality. And what we see today around COVID-19, for example, is an example of that. I mean, this is called a 3 Sigma event that happens very rarely, but as and when it does, the implications are, quite serious, quite onerous. And so despite the dashboards that come our way and any other metric which comes, very often these will not reflect a less recurring black swan event as the one we're seeing today. And then how do you use technology to measure these dashboards effectively, and how do you standardize them to make them more legible and understandable by, for example, board directors who aren't necessarily clinicians or doctors, as independent directors. They also need to be as incubated, and you've got to make whatever you share with them, I think, substantial enough, but standard enough so that it can be actioned.
Thank you. So in the interest of keeping this as a dialogue, this isn't necessarily a question, but it was feedback from one of the participants. So they've said, until the legal system governs clinical malpractice through criminal courts rather than civil courts, they believe that physicians will always err on the side of caution rather than blindly follow best practice, e.g. cutting down episiotomy rates. So I think there's a number of topics there that have been mentioned. We're just sharing that for the sake of trying to keep it as interactive as possible. There's one more.
I think it's a good point. This would be the clinician. This would be the clinical justification for things like this a lot of the time. We are just, we have certain not boxes that we need to tick, but we need to show that. In many ways, it is a box ticking exercise. But if we can't deliver, this is an extreme example, but a baby safely or in an optimal time frame, or kind of if we think that that the risk is, and I wouldn't say higher than a normal risk, but higher than the level of risk that a lot of the clinicians here operate with, then they will opt for the safest from a clinical outcomes perspective point of view. but that isn't necessarily to say that that's the right way to do things. I guess, yeah, and doctors here need to feel that they are also protected, and that their decision making is protected, and that it's transparent, and that if there is a bad patient outcome, that they will be protected by the institution that they are in, but also by the letter of the law. And again, and it comes back to this area of trust, you know. The statement suggests that there is an inherent lack of trust in the system, that doctors can't operate as they might do in other circumstances because they feel that they would not be protected.
But again, it goes back to, I think, the question of regulation and monitoring. I mean, if all the effective systems are in place within these organizations, then potentially there is an audit, not just a financial audit, but a quality audit, process audit. And this does lead us to, I think, the final question for today, because we're running out of time. But how do you manage and monitor the governance status within healthcare entities in the UAE healthcare system? So how do you do that? Or is it down to each of the facilities to audit themselves and share and publish those results? Or is it mandated transparency that's required? This individual says that they've been pushing for transparency for surgical outcomes in the UAE for years, but there are obvious reasons why that meets resistance, again, public versus private. So again, the reporting question, how do we manage that? I think you've touched upon it, Sophie, that has to be mandated from the top, and then we'll follow suit in terms of best practice. But is there anything else you'd like to add in that regard?
I think transparency is also best, is always best. Where it doesn't exist, it must be mandated initially, and then at some point self-regulation will follow. Yeah.
Brilliant. I think we're just going to conclude now. So I'd like to ask you both your final perspectives, final thoughts on the future of the healthcare sector in the region and the role of governance in its expansion. So just a few parting words. Orhan, I'll start with you.
Yes, no, as I've indicated, and again, this is because, you know, healthcare is all we do. Despite everything we see, we continue to be very upbeat on the opportunities both here, the broader MENA region, and then further afield. And that's driven by 2 or 3 primary factors. One, there's obviously a healthcare demand which continues to rise and grow on the basis of demographics. There's a big gap, and there has been, between what was spent in the UK, in Europe, in the US historically, and what we see transpire here nowadays, whether it's in the Gulf or in the broader, you know, MENA region. So I think the pent up demand or need for private capital here is substantial. And then you've got on the periphery other elements that you know are making everything we just spoke about more topical. And I had mentioned early on, you know, implications around the, you know, our new lifestyle, urbanization, eating habits, you know, and so forth. So I think all of this, for folks like ourselves who have capital to deploy in the space, I think make the opportunity very very compelling. And to go back to, I think, the headline of this this panel, it's about how do we marry our aptitude and our skill set around the space, because we're monolithic around healthcare. And alongside me at TVM is a number of you know, former clinicians, doctors, key opinion leaders, and so forth, people who know the space well. So how do we marry our knowledge of that space, you know, the various, you know, healthcare subsectors, whether it be cancer or oncology, home care, home nursing, and so forth, and optimize, if you will, what we invest for the benefit of our stakeholders. And I think it goes back to just governance. Let's call it integrated governance or corporate and clinical governance. But these are I think, the cylinders in the engine, which de facto, you know, help us, if you will, enhance, expand, maximize, you know, shareholder value and stakeholder value.
Perfect. Thank you.
I echo what all hands says. I'm immensely optimistic about healthcare in the region. Wherever there's a gap, there is an opportunity. So as long as there are spaces for governance to improve for companies like ours, it means that we will be kept busy building in better ways for the next 30 or 50 years. And if you've got a company and you are inclined to employ people and employ them in a good way and a better way than people have necessarily been employed or deployed before, it's very exciting.
Fabulous. Thank you. Well, thank you both for your time and insights. Really insightful, really nice getting your different perspectives from different fields. I certainly found it very valuable. I hope our attendees, our guests, found it insightful. And once again, thank you for the support, and thank you to everyone that tuned into our first virtual webinar. Hopefully the first of many, but not for too long. Hope the situation to improve slowly. But in the meantime, Panel Initiative have got webinars that you can go on our events page. You can see all of our webinars that are lined up. We're using the opportunity to tap into experts that potentially may have been too busy in the past. So hopefully you'll find it. And thank you very much, and take care.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Bye-bye.